Welcome back, everyone. So I know we're spending a lot of time with setState, and you might be wondering, Yihua, let's just build Monster's Rolodex. But I really think this forms a great, solid foundation moving forward of really understanding the code that you're writing and how React's engine works at a high level. If we build this solid foundation of just understanding how through setState and state and this class component that React determines when to re-render or render a component, we really can very quickly understand all of the other nuances of components in React, as well as why something is working or not working, and just the general flow of everything. Because as I mentioned with React, it's really just all about components and how and when they render or re-render. With setState, I showed you earlier that when we just pass the object, we do a shallow merge, which in turn React does do an update. But inside of this same function, so the same callback that we gave to onClick, we also did a console log.this.state. And yet for some reason, once this console log ran, we were seeing our old state object and not the new one. So just to clarify, when we refresh here, what we should begin with is Hi Yihua Zhang. This should be the initial state, which it is, as we see demonstrated in the UI. But I click change name, UI updates to Andre Niagoy, but for some reason the console log still shows the previous. Why is this? So this again actually has to do with the way that React does its re-rendering, which is where it re-rendered our component. However, with this setState call, what's happening here with the shallow merge is that this is actually happening asynchronously. So typically with JavaScript code happens in a synchronous manner, meaning that it runs one by one by one by one. In this particular case, we're expecting that within our callback that we update the state and then we console log this.state. But clearly, as we see, this is getting run first. However, the state is not being updated when this console log runs, meaning that the state at this point is still the previous one. Why is this? Is because React batches these different setState calls so that it can determine what the most optimal strategy for re-rendering the website is going to be. What do I mean by this? Well, let's say you imagine that you have an application where you have a lot of different components. And perhaps through one interaction, one button click, you're actually updating the state in multiple components, not just this one. Because inside of here, we have one component right now with one state. But you can imagine how in a more complex app, one interaction might update the state of multiple different components. In that case, React doesn't want to just completely isolate and do all those different updates independently. React wants to figure out if it can stack these together, or maybe there's a more optimal way of updating these components so that it is more performant. That's all what React is doing under the hood for us. So as a result, setState as a call is a non-synchronous call. It's an asynchronous call, meaning that when console.log, which is a synchronous call, gets called, at this point, the state might not be updated. It may or it may not be. Chances are it's not. So you might be wondering then, well, with setState then, what if I want to use the latest state after I've updated it inside of my code somehow? Like in our case, I want to console log and make sure that my state is up to date. Now we can achieve this where instead of passing this object to setState, we can pass it a function. So in this format, there's actually a different way. So as I mentioned, we can pass it a function. And what we can also pass it is a callback. So these are two different arguments that you can pass to setState. If you pass it like this, you'll actually be able to get a more consistent synchronous behavior, not really, but just at least one where we anticipate what's going to happen. So let me break this down. So I'm going to comment this out. So this first function is a updater function. The first function that you pass to setState here is going to be some function where you return an object that it will then use to shallow merge against state. So this is kind of very similar to what we did before when we just passed the object that we wanted to shallow merge against state as the argument to setState. But now instead, we're passing a function that returns this object that we want to, again, shallow merge. So you might be wondering, what's the point of doing this additional function? Well, the reason why we do this is because within this function, we get access to state as well as props. Props I'm going to cover later, but state, at this current moment, this state variable that we have access to is equal to the current state. And the reason why we want to use this is because sometimes we want to maybe update our state based on the previous value of the state. Props, on the other hand, is something that does with components. It's different values that you can pass to your component, and we're going to do a whole separate lesson on that and deeper understand it. For now, just understand that you don't really need it right now, but if you wanted to utilize props somehow inside of your state, you can do so. But again, don't worry about it. These are both optional, as you can see right here. I'm not even going to use it. I'm just going to use the return where I pass the object that I want to have. So let's just save this and see if it still works. So if we go back, here we see Yihua Zhang. I hit change name. It's updated to Andre Niagoy. So just like we saw earlier, this is doing that same state update as we had before. React is registering, oh, it's a different object in memory. I can now re-render, which we saw. But I mentioned earlier that we want to see the console log show the correct value. Well, that's actually what this second argument is, this function that we wrote, this callback. Again, as I mentioned, a callback is just a function that my code says, oh, once I'm finished, I want you to run this callback. So here inside of this function, we can write whatever we want. And I'm just going to console log the new state, so this.state. And what happens here is that this console log inside of this function is going to run only after all of the state changes have been applied. Meaning that only when React has determined in its asynchronous manner, oh, I've updated shallow merge the state and now the state is the new object, then I'm going to run this callback function. So now if we save this and we go back, now if I hit change name, what we'll see is that we have the correct newly updated state. And this format is actually the ideal optimal way that you should be writing your setState code in class components. The reason for this is just because by doing this, it's much more clear what's happening. You don't have to use the previous state or the props values, as I mentioned. We're definitely not doing that here. But in this way, anyone looking at it just anticipates and understands what's going to happen. It's going to understand that, oh, this object, just like before, is just going to be the thing that gets shallow merged, but also that this follow-up callback, if there is one, is going to run only after the state is fully updated, which makes it much easier to think about what's going to happen. You don't have to consider, oh my God, at this current moment, is my code actually updated or not? You know for sure that React is handling that. The moment that the state is up to date is only when this callback is going to get run. Now, again, this callback is also entirely optional. You don't have to pass it. You can just pass it this function. If you don't want to run a callback after state updates, there's nothing wrong with that. If we refresh and we clear out our console, we change name, our code still just works. So this is just a very key thing to understanding setState and how React determines when to update, when to batch things to make it more performant, and also when to run after it's updated the state. And this is really all it is. I know there's a lot that we learned about setState, and we're going to get a lot of practice. So don't worry. We're going to practice with it. We're going to get familiar with it so that as we build out Monster's Rolodex, it'll become like second nature to you about using setState. I know I talked a lot about setState and it's really boring and really technical, but now we can start using setState to actually build out our Monster's Rolodex application. And as promised, I'm also going to talk about props and how that gets involved as well. So in the next video, let's start building out our application.